roles. I've also been in staff development as well, and I'm happy to join you to talk about OER. The way I came across OER is I've been teaching with OER for a while now, and I also decided, as part of my doctoral work, I'm currently a doctoral student at SMU, going into my my last semester and concluding my study. I'm looking at factors that contribute to a faculty member's decision to engage in OER development at the campus level. And so OER is part of my doctoral work, and I've spent the last basically 2 to 3 years immersed in the OER world, learning more, doing as much as I can about OER, learning as much as I can about OER. With me today, Lori Hill is going to be monitoring the chat session. So and she'll be posting links and things as well as we move forward. So if you have a question, feel free to ask it at any time, and then Lori will either ask me the question, or she'll make me aware of the question in some way. So so again, let's get started. So I wanted to just give you a brief overview of what we'll be talking about today. Certainly, we start with a little introduction, but as far as OER is concerned, I'm going to really talk about why OER, what is OER, what is it, what is OER, and maybe what isn't OER, and then how do I use it, how do I create OER, and then where can I find it if I don't have time to create it, and then we'll have some time to wrap up as well. So I just want to get a little bit of a sense of the room. If you could just type in the chat A, B, C, or D, depending on what your level of engagement is with OER currently. Okay, so okay. See some B's, I see some A's. That's good. See some B's. Adopters, that's good. Some C's. Okay. B's, all right, A and B, excellent. So no D's, that's good. So all of you are at least somewhat familiar with OER. If not, you've developed it in some way, which is good. So that gives me a good sense of the room. So I want to talk a little bit about why OER. So why do people produce this? What is the point, right? And for me, I think, and for others in the research, I think there's this sort of underlying thought about or value around the freedom of knowledge, right? This idea that knowledge should be shared with the world, and knowledge should be open, and should be shared with others so they could continue the work that you've started, so to speak. So that's one of the reasons why some people are drawn to open educational resources, is the idea of freedom of knowledge and the idea that knowledge should be open. Another reason why it's gained popularity, in particular with things like textbooks, is the fact that college textbooks have just grown to be really expensive, right? As you can see here, other items have grown in price as well, but nothing has grown like college textbooks in comparison to some of these other things, right? Tuition and fees, yes, they've grown. Childcare has grown. We talk about how childcare has grown, the cost of childcare, but look at the cost of college textbooks. Like, there was one study that I looked at, and I think it was in a 10-year span, it grew threefold, the cost of textbooks. So So one of the reasons OER sort of exploded particularly with OER textbooks, is this idea that college affordability is important. It's an equitable thing, right? And so the cost of textbooks became one of those reasons, with one of those reasons why, you know, people decided that OER is a potential solution for the escalating cost of textbooks. Another reason that has sort of emerged, I would say more recently, is sort of the social justice aspects of open educational resources, right? As people have started adopting, and more importantly, as people have started to develop OER, educators have realized, wow, this is beyond just the fact that it's affordable for students. This is really an opportunity for me to shine a light on traditionally marginalized voices, right? Or the traditional canon of what is considered proper scholarship in a field of study. And so what some educators have found is that this OER is really an avenue for that, an avenue to spotlight potentially researchers that traditionally aren't spotlighted, to show diverse perspectives, whether it be culturally, nationally, geographically, racially, in those aspects as well. And so what you found is that these educators are asking, whose voices are being marginalized, and how can we leverage the fact that we have flexibility around developing educational content. How can we leverage this opportunity to unsilence these voices, right? And yes, absolutely. So I know someone's asking about whether or not these tools or this information that I'm gathered will be available. Yes, absolutely. We can send this out, or you can contact me directly, and I'll give my information after the session, and I'm happy to share with you anything that I've created as part of this presentation. So so when you think about how OER is defined, I like this idea of OER, right? In open education in general. It's along the lines of the social justice lens, right? And I'm really seeing this sort of in the forefront, not only in my own doctoral work and in the studies that I've done, but in other research on the effectiveness of OER. One of the benefits that people are starting to realize is the fact that you get to benefit and empower non-privileged learners, and you get to voice some of the voiceless in educational systems, particularly those that have been marginalized in some way, shape, or form. So let's talk a little bit about some metrics, like what is OER's impact, right? And so there have been several studies that have shown OER's impact for students. The study in 2009 by Clinton and Kahn showed that there were lowered drops and failing and W rates, and students had also talked about there were in that same study there was very little different. They noticed no difference in the quality of the instructional materials. Another study by Colvert et al. They found something similar to Kahn, so that the same thing, that there were lower DFW rates, but they also had higher grades. They found higher grades for Pell Grant, part-time, and historically underserved students. which is an interesting finding. Oh, sorry. And then this other study showed that that students actually rated faculty higher, and showed that they wanted to take faculty who use OER more often than they would with a faculty member who just used traditional instructional or publisher materials. What we're also starting to see now is some of the benefits for faculty, right? So early on, a lot of the studies were about, well, how does this impact students? But more recently, you're starting to see, well, how does this impact faculty? What are their sort of takeaways in either adopting OER or in developing OER? And one study found that faculty reflected in that they really liked that they got to learn from more experienced faculty, particularly new faculty, because OER development is typically in some cases at the campus level, they're sort of handled in collaboration, and so in these cases, faculties have said, we get to learn from other experienced faculty, and that's a good thing. It makes me a better teacher, that kind of thing. The other thing is faculty have really said they enjoy the fact that there's a flexibility around the resources. Certainly, that's something that I found important when I started adopting OER. It sort of forced me to think about a text in a different way. Traditionally, I would select one text because I was concerned with the cost for students. But with OER, what I could do is I could say, well, I really like this text as a primary text, this OER text, but there's this chapter in this other OER text that I really like for this module that I'm doing. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to use that chapter for that particular module, and it allowed me to really rethink the system that I was using for providing content and material for my students into a way that allowed me to be a lot more flexible and provide the type of material that I wanted to do. And beyond that, if I wanted to go in with the flexibility that OER allows, if I wanted to go in and make changes, adapt or update, certainly I would be able to do that as well. And so faculty have really in these surveys and in these studies have really said they love the idea that it's so flexible. These resources are so flexible. And then of course, Weller, in his study, faculty talked about how they were much more reflective of their practices, and it improved sort of their approach to teaching, not just the material that they were using, but also how they structured assignments, how they thought about teaching, how they thought about learning, and things of that nature. So as you can see, there's all sorts of benefits that the research has shown around benefits for faculty and benefits for students. So at its essence, I just want to because I think early on, one of the barriers to OER adoption was the idea that people weren't exactly sure what OER was and what it wasn't. And so at its essence, OER is it's a lot of things, right? I mean, certainly there are textbooks, but OERs really could be images, it can be videos, it can be any kind of interactive content. It could be whole courses or just like lessons. It could be study guides. So anything that's educational in nature is potentially OER, right? The other part that OER is at its essence is open, which means it's free of cost for those who want to use it, particularly students, and it's stored somewhere publicly so that people can get to it, right? And often there's some licensing that's associated with that, particularly Creative Commons licensing. I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a little bit, but essentially there's some, there can be some licensing, and the idea is that it's shared with others. And then, and really the only other thing is that OERs, in most cases, pretty much in every case, digitally formatted educational tools. So something that's available digitally is OER. So I want to just give you a brief overview of a brief history of sort of the origins of OER. Some of you may know about this, and some of you may not. But essentially, the first time OER, someone called something OER, was in reference to it was as part of this UNESCO conference in July of 2002 in Paris, France. And there were several groups, particularly MIT, who had this open courseware project, which essentially they were creating courses, online courses, and they were just making them available, and they called it open courseware. And there were other groups that were interested in doing this, and as part of the documentation for the meeting notes, someone references that essentially we need a name for this, and so they suggested that the name be Open Educational Resources, and UNESCO sort of adopted that name as part of what it was going to be referring to these objects, right? Somewhere around that same time, in the early 2000s, there were, and this was partly due to the exponential growth of online. There were folks in online distance ed groups that were creating what we referred to as learning objects, and and as part of the growth of online, these educators sort of found it important to be able to share these resources with the greater community. And so as part of that, there were groups like Merlot that created a repository for early OER, particularly for online learning, that were called learning objects, right? And so these consisted of smaller things. They weren't open courseware like big courses, but they were these sort of smaller, documents, videos, assignments, lessons, sort of interactive learning tools. A lot of early Flash stuff was added in Merlot, and you could go there and find things. The challenges around that were interoperability. Early learning management systems didn't talk well with some of these tools, and that made it challenging. But they were out there, right? And you could go out and search for these things and find them and use them in your course. And that started as early as 2000. And again, that was partly in conjunction with the growth of online learning. Well, somewhere around 2012, MOOCs came along, and so MOOCs are they are OER actually. So they exploded on the scene in around 2012, and they were hailed as a potential disruptor in an innovation in higher education that was going to change higher ed. And I don't know that they completely changed higher ed. Certainly they had an impact, but this was around the time where higher education was being looked at as there was more accountability from state level, national level, federal level around college affordability, and so MOOCs sort of attempted to fill that gap of creating a space where open access to courses. Of course, the impact wasn't there. There were issues around how these were structured, and they didn't offer credit in some cases, and so they didn't have the impact that potentially they could have had, but they were sort of put OER on the map with regard to having it be something that people understood as, oh, open is important, right? This is something that we should be doing, and really, what you see most recently is sort of the growth and the explosion of OER textbooks. So OER textbooks sort of filling the need of traditional textbooks and college affordability. So attempting to do kind of what MOOCs were attempting to do, but in a different way, right? So when you think about OER these days, most people think about it from the idea of textbooks. And so I thought this slide was really important, this idea of the flexibility. We had talked about some of the research says that, faculty really like the fact that open educational resources are flexible. And so this is sort of the open spectrum, right? And what I like about this slide is that it differentiates the idea of open educational resources and open access resources, right? So open access resources are resources that you potentially can get through the library, it's research, things of that nature, where you may be able to get them for free, but you're not going to be able to change them in any way. And open educational resources, as you can see here, becomes the more flexible sort of alternative to, when you're thinking about textbooks, you're looking at commercial textbooks being the most expensive, most restrictive, and then obviously library resources being free but restrictive, and then open OER representing the most cost-effective and the most flexible for textbooks, certainly for other materials as well. All right, so so how do you use OER, right? Typically, when you think about the ways in which you can use OER, there's this sort of popular tenets, which are the 5 R's of open educational resources. So essentially, you can reuse content, and that's what some folks have done, right? Some folks have just adopted. That's what I did. I essentially took textbooks that had already been created and I reused them as is. I didn't make any specific changes. I just reused them as is. And so you can certainly reuse them. Those who develop OER can retain some sort of copyright. And again, as I mentioned earlier, it's typically the copyright that's used for OER is Creative Commons, which allows the creator to provide openness to their materials, but also provides some types of stipulation. Like, for instance, you could develop something and say you can use this as long as it's for non-commercial use, or you can use my material so long as you attribute me or the original person, right? Things of that nature. So there is this idea that you can retain some rights, limited rights to the materials in which you develop. Then obviously you can revise materials, and that can be all kinds of revisions. What you're seeing a lot in OER circles is revising by translating these materials into other languages to be used in other countries. So you're seeing a lot of revision as far as language translation. You can also remix. So take something that somebody developed and then add your, either new research or things of that nature. So certainly that's available for you to remix. And then obviously the idea is that you can redistribute. So whatever it is that you've revised, remixed, can be republished in its revised or remixed form, or even in its original form. So as you think about the possibilities of how you might use OER, this is the 5 R's are certainly something you want to keep in mind. The other thing I would say that has grown with the growth of OER is this idea of OEP, or Open Educational Practices. And the big tenets of what OEP is and the OEP movement is this idea that we should be creating opportunities for student-driven learning, right? This idea that students should have a say in some of the pathways which they learn, and engage in the learning process, particularly at the course level, right? Certainly, community colleges and other institutions have been at the forefront in learning pathways around degree programs. But this sort of takes it a step further and says, how can we engage students in creating learning pathways within the course and gain ownership of that process within the course? The other tenet is this idea of knowledge co-creation, right? So the idea that knowledge, you can take a course, for instance, as an opportunity to create knowledge with students as part of the learning process. So some educational practices have created study guides, where students work together to go over materials and create essentially a study guide for other groups to use, for themselves to use. So they participate in the creation of that knowledge, and by participating and sort of being treated as colleagues in that process, they get a much deeper understanding of the material and much deeper understanding of how scholarly work works within higher education, and then they get to take that work beyond the course. And then and I think the other tenet around open educational practices is the idea that it builds a scholarly community, right? So that it moves beyond the idea of active learning and really asks students to further the dialogue around the research in the industry, what's missing, what's not missing, right? And in certain aspects of education, that's important, right? Particularly like in emerging industries where industries are just getting a foothold on research and things of that nature. The other thing is that it also allows students a voice within the social justice aspects of the educational experiences, right? So how do you unmarginalize voices? Well, you give them an opportunity to voice their perspectives as students, and so that's certainly another way. The other thing that in my own doctoral work that I've heard is that this provides to take the educational, this OER and OEP provides faculty with the opportunity to create what they call more long-lasting and enduring educational experiences. So in a traditional classroom setting, you may have an assignment and a student turns in that assignment, and then you provide feedback, and then sort of that assignment, essentially that learning experience ends at that point, right? But in an open educational practice assignment, students create this thing, whether it be some form of knowledge, and then that knowledge is used by others and it endures, or that student uses that as part of their work in another experience or things of that nature. So it's built upon and it lives beyond the boundaries of that particular course. And so just something to think about when you're thinking about the benefits of open educational resources. There's also this whole movement around open educational practices. So let's say you're just interested in adopting at this point, maybe not necessarily interested in developing. There are all types of repositories now where you can find open educational resources. You know, there's OpenStax. So this is not an exhaustive list by any means, but I wanted to post some of the more useful and comprehensive and maybe relevant resources for you. So there's OpenStax, which is a nonprofit. It's based out of Rice University in Houston, and they have all types of materials. That, you know, they're building new materials all the time. They actually build materials. They also build like course cartridges as part of it. They build supplemental materials, so like test banks and all kinds of stuff. So they're very comprehensive in their offerings, and so that's certainly a good start if you're wanting to look at OER adoption. The other thing I would say that I would have you look at is Pressbooks. So Pressbooks is a website and a tool that a lot of institutions use that have internal OER programs. So you know, they're building OER at their campus level, and then they're making it available for students, and they typically will publish their stuff in Pressbooks. And typically Pressbooks is open to anyone, but you'll see that some Pressbook sites are sort of branded to particular institutions, but there's a lot there as well. You know, as you can see there, there's over 3,000 books published around 109 Pressbooks networks. The other thing I wanted to make you aware of is that the state of Texas actually has its own OER repository now. I think it went live early last year, I believe, and that's OERTX. And our state actually has a very robust system for OER, well, more robust than most states. The state of Texas has adopted a definition of OER. We're going to talk a little bit about the grants around OER for the state of Texas, but state of Texas is doing a lot with OER. You know, they're looking at it, and they're looking at it from the lens of the high enrollment courses. They're looking at it from the lens of college affordability, student affordability, and things of that nature. So certainly take a look at OERTX and the repository there. And then there's OER Commons, which is another sort of digital library of open educational resources. It's one that's fairly common and has a lot of different resources. And again, there are tons of these OER repositories. If you're teaching in a discipline that you think is going to be difficult to find something, certainly you can reach out to me and I could help you with that. The other thing I would say is that Canada they're probably a few years ahead of us when it comes to creating an infrastructure for supporting OER. They have a ton of stuff. They have a lot of the research in North America is coming out of Canada on OER, and so if we can't find it in something in the States, certainly Canada is an option for OER repositories. They have, like I said, they have so much stuff as well. So many resources on OER. Let's see. So if you're interested in developing OER, there is a lot of money out there as well for OER. So I wanted to make you aware of one in particular, which is the Texas OER grant program, and Texas actually has upped their investment in OER development. I think the last article I read, they had allocated somewhere along the lines of $21 million specifically for OER development. And so they're looking at having groups of faculty work together to develop OER textbooks for their high enrollment courses, right? The Texas core curriculum courses. and they'll pay a maximum of $25,000 to either a faculty member or teams of faculty to develop these resources. And they have a competitive bid process. I believe there have been one or two Tarrant County College faculty members who have actually been funded as part of this process. So certainly this is something that is available to you as educators if you're interested in seeking funding for open educational resources. What the funding will typically, if you're kind of wondering how this funding works and what it usually pays for, typically what the funding will pay for is some sort of faculty stipend, right? So faculty will get some of this money, but faculty member can also use the money for hiring people to develop things for the OER. So in some cases, OER needs images, the OER text will need graphics, things of that nature. OER, sometimes you'll need an editor or a couple of editors, depending on the nature of whatever you're building. And so those grants will help sort of fund that process. Certainly a peer review process could help fund some of the peer review process for your project and things of that nature. There's also a lot of groups, particularly like the Hewlett Foundation. I know that Achieving the Dream has an OER degree initiative where institutions get together and they say, we're going to build these zero cost, zero textbook cost degree programs, and they will fund aspects of that. And Achieving the Dream has great data on the institutions that have engaged in that work. And so certainly that's another avenue. And these are just two of the many. Certainly, again, if you're interested in developing OER, certainly I will make myself available to help you find the resources that you need in order to move this type of work forward. It's certainly something that I'm passionate about and interested in helping others with. So I have reached the end of my presentation, but I wanted to give you some time to ask any questions or to think about open educational resources. Let's see, some questions are coming in. Let me pull up my chat here. Okay, so somebody's sharing a site they've used for English and literature courses. Absolutely. Yeah, the sites that I shared are not exhaustive at all. There are so many different sites that have OER. And then now, because of the institutional support around OER, there's so many internal sites. So many institutions have their own OER programs that are run by their library or by their Center for Teaching and Learning. And this provides, or supported by their Center for Teaching and Learning, and this provides, just a huge amount of resources that are out there waiting to be adopted or waiting to be remixed or revised as part of this process. Any other questions, thoughts? I've got my information here. You can find me on Twitter. I tweet about OER and other things. If you want to contact me, you can contact me through our department, which is ID Connect, or you can find me on Teams, or you can email me directly as well. It's the same as my email. All right. Well, I appreciate your time today. If you don't have any other questions, you have an announcement?
I just wanted to make sure everybody filled out the feedback form about the session. Allegra put it in, and I'll paste it in again, so just you guys take the survey. We would appreciate it.
And thank you all for your time this morning. Have a great rest of the Connections Week, and I will see you soon at some point, I'm sure.
And we did record this session, by the way, if anybody wants to go back and review it, it'll be in the chat.